Upon entering the hall of Lubon station, I instinctively glanced at the clock. 2 hours and 10 minutes remained until the express to Paris was due to arrive. Suddenly, a wave of fatigue swept over me as though I had walked a dozen versts on foot. I looked around, half hoping to find some suggestion scrawled on the walls, how to kill time. Still preoccupied with the same thought, I stepped back out onto the station porch. The street, resembling a boulevard, was lined with scraggly acacias and climbed steadily uphill between 2 rows of houses uneven in height and varied in architecture, as is often the case in small towns. At the crest of the hill, at the far end of the street, a cluster of trees could be seen, as if the road ended in a park. From time to time, a cat would dart across the street, leaping cautiously over the gutters. A stray dog scurried from tree to tree, sniffing at the roots in search of kitchen scraps. Not a single human soul was in sight. A heavy melancholy settled over me. What to do? What on earth to do? I already foresaw the endless, inevitable wait in a tiny railway cafe, seated before a mug of revolting beer and a barely legible local newspaper. And then I noticed a funeral procession emerging from a side alley onto the street where I stood. The sight of the hearse brought unexpected relief. At least it would distract me for 10 minutes or so. But my attention quickly deepened. The deceased was accompanied by only 8 men, one of whom was weeping. The others chatted amiably among themselves. There was no priest. These must be secular funerals, I thought. Then it occurred to me, in a town like Lubon, surely there are at least 100 freethinkers. Why weren't they here? The brisk pace of the procession clearly indicated that the burial would be without ceremony and therefore without religion. My idle curiosity flared. I began to construct all manner of theories. And when the funeral carriage drew level with me, a strange idea struck, to join the 8 gentlemen. That way, I'd at least be occupied for an hour. I set off behind them, wearing a suitably mournful expression. 2 of the men at the rear turned to look at me with surprise, then began whispering to each other. Evidently, they were wondering whether I was a local. They then addressed the men walking ahead, who also glanced back at me. Their scrutiny unsettled me, and to put an end to it, I approached the nearest pair. "Forgive me for interrupting your conversation," I began, politely. Seeing a secular funeral, I hurried to join, though I don't know whom you are accompanying. "It is a woman," one of the gentlemen replied. "But these are secular rites, aren't they?" I asked, surprised. The second gentleman, evidently eager to clarify, joined in. "Yes and no," he said. "The clergy refused to perform the church service." "Ah," I exclaimed, taken aback, not quite grasping the situation. My new acquaintance lowered his voice and began to confide in me. "Oh, it's a long story. This young woman took her own life, and so she could not be buried with Christian rites. That man ahead, the one who's crying, is her husband." "You've astonished and intrigued me, sir," I said thoughtfully. "Would it be indiscreet of me to ask you to tell me the story? If I'm being a nuisance, please don't feel obliged to answer." "Not at all, not at all," the gentleman replied, taking my arm with quiet trust. "Let's fall back a little. I'll tell you everything. It's a very sad tale. We've got time before we reach the cemetery. It's up there, among the trees, and the climb is rather steep. Imagine," he began, "this young woman, Madame Paula Motte, was the daughter of a wealthy local merchant, Fontenelle. At the age of 11, she became the victim of a horrific crime. She was raped by a servant. She nearly died, mutilated by that scoundrel, whose own brutality gave him away. A sordid trial followed, and it came to light that the poor girl had been the victim of this brute for 3 whole months. He was sentenced to life in penal servitude. The little girl grew up marked by shame, lonely, without friends. Adults barely touched her, as if afraid to defile themselves by brushing their lips against her brow. To the entire town, she became something of a monster, a strange phenomenon. "Do you know little Fontenelle?" people whispered. Whenever she appeared on the street, passers-by turned to look. It was impossible even to find a nanny to take her out for walks, and the servants from other households avoided her, as though she carried a contagion that infected anyone who came near. It was heartbreaking to watch the poor child during her afternoon outings, when children gathered in the square. She stood alone beside her maid, gazing sadly at the joyful games of her peers. Sometimes, unable to resist the longing to join them, she would timidly, hesitantly step into their circle, as if aware she had no right to be there. And immediately, the benches emptied. Mothers, nannies, aunts snatched up their daughters and led them away. Little Fontenelle was left standing, bewildered, not understanding why. She would begin to cry, her heart torn with sorrow. Then, sobbing, she would run to her maid and bury her face in her apron. As she grew older, things only worsened. She was shunned like a leper. Think about it, this young girl already knew everything. She had no claim to the symbolic orange blossoms, and before she had even learned to read, she had been exposed to the fatal secret that mothers barely dare to reveal to their daughters on the eve of their wedding. When she walked down the street with her governess, guarded as if from some new horror, her eyes lowered beneath the weight of her shame, the young girls, far less naive than one might suppose, would begin whispering, sneaking glances at her, laughing behind her back, and quickly turning away if she happened to meet their gaze. She was barely greeted. Only a few men tipped their hats to her. The mothers pretended not to see her. And the boys, mocking, called her Madame Baptiste after the servant who had disgraced and destroyed her. No one knew the torment that consumed her soul. She never spoke, never smiled. Even her parents felt uneasy around her, as if they resented her for being a living reminder of the irreparable. A decent man would not shake hands with a freed convict, even if that convict were his own son, would he? Monsieur and Madame Fontenelle looked at their daughter as one might look at a son returned from penal servitude. And yet she was beautiful, pale, slender, with noble bearing. If not for her story, I would have found her quite charming, sir. A year and a half ago, a new subprefect arrived in our town, bringing with him his private secretary, a cheerful young man who seemed to have spent his life in the Latin Quarter. He saw Mademoiselle Fontenelle and fell in love. They told him everything. He merely shrugged. Bah! What of it? If anything, it's a kind of guarantee. Better that it happened before than after. With a wife like her, I can rest easy. He began courting her, proposed, and married her. After the wedding, he made his social rounds with confidence, as though nothing had ever happened. Some returned his visits, others did not. Gradually, everything began to fade, and she found her place in society. It must be said, she adored her husband. Just think, he had restored her honor, made her an equal among others, defied public opinion, braved ridicule. He had shown a courage rare even among the noblest of men. She loved him with a reverent, trembling passion. When she became pregnant, even the most fastidious ladies opened their homes to her, as though motherhood had finally cleansed her of the past. It may sound absurd, but that's how it was. Everything was going splendidly until the recent town festival. The prefect, surrounded by officials, presided over the choral competition. After his speech, the medals were distributed by Paul Amott, the secretary. You know how it goes in such moments: envy flares, rivalry ignites, and reason is often lost. All the town's ladies were seated on the platform. The bandmaster from the Marmillion Orchestra approached the stage. His ensemble had been awarded second prize. After all, not everyone can receive first place, can they? When Amott handed him the medal, the man hurled it back at him and shouted, "Give your medal to Baptiste. He's the one who deserves first prize, just like me." The crowd burst into laughter. Crowds are cruel and coarse. Every eye turned toward the poor woman. "Sir, have you ever seen a woman lose her mind?" "No." "Well, we have." She rose to her feet, then collapsed back into her chair. And again. And again. 3 times in total, as if trying to flee, only to realize she couldn't break through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Hey, Madame Baptiste." And a roar followed, a mix of mockery and outrage. Chaos erupted. People repeated the nickname, stood on tiptoe to catch a glimpse of her face. Husbands lifted their wives so they could see her. Someone asked, "Is it the one in the blue dress?" Boys crowed like roosters. Laughter rang out from every corner. She sat motionless, off to the side, dazed, as if put on display. She couldn't vanish, couldn't hide, couldn't even cover her face. Her eyelids fluttered rapidly, as though her eyes were blinded by a harsh light, and she breathed like a horse driven uphill to exhaustion. It was unbearable to look at her. Amott lunged at the offender, and the two of them tumbled to the ground. The celebration was abruptly cut short. An hour later, as the couple walked home, the young woman, silent since the moment of humiliation, trembling as if a spring inside her had snapped, suddenly stepped over the railing of the bridge and, before her husband could stop her, threw herself into the river. The water beneath the arches was deep. Her body was recovered only 2 hours later. Of course, she was dead. The narrator fell silent. "Perhaps it was the only thing she could do," he added. "Some wounds never heal. Now you understand why the church closed its doors." Oh, had these been church funerals, the whole town would have come. But suicide, especially tied to that old story, drove everyone away. And here, to bury someone without a priest, it's no easy thing. We passed through the cemetery gates. Moved, I waited until the coffin was lowered into the grave, then approached the grieving widower and offered him my hand. He looked at me through his tears, surprised, and said, "Thank you." And I did not regret having joined that sorrowful procession.